There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from being left. It comes from being approached, and then watched, as the approach quietly reverses itself. You know this feeling if you've lived it. A conversation that felt different from all the others. A closeness that arrived without warning, and then, just as quickly, without explanation, pulled itself back out of reach. And you were left standing in the space it used to occupy, wondering what you did wrong. Here is the first thing you need to hear today. You likely did nothing wrong at all. Carl Jung spent much of his career studying a pattern that looks, on the surface, like contradiction. Someone moves close. Then they disappear. Then, sometimes, they come close again, as if nothing happened. Most people read this as mixed signals, or worse, as proof that the other person simply doesn't care enough. But Jung's work points towards something else entirely, something far more specific and far more human than indifference. Today we're going to walk through the real psychological reason behind this pattern, not the surface explanation, the one underneath it. And by the end, you may find that the person who confused you the most finally makes a strange kind of sense. Let's start with what closeness actually does to a nervous system that isn't used to it. Most people assume that connection feels good to everyone in the same way. Warmth, safety, ease. But for someone who learned early in life that closeness comes with a cost, connection doesn't register as simple comfort. It registers as risk, not consciously, not as a thought they could easily describe to you. In the part of the mind that reacts before it reasons, closeness gets filed next to danger. This is not something a person chooses. It's something that gets built, usually a long time before you ever met them. A childhood where love was inconsistent. A past relationship that ended in a way that left a mark deeper than they've ever admitted. A lesson, learned early and reinforced often, that wanting something too openly is how you end up hurt. It's worth pausing here, because this is the piece most explanations of this pattern skip entirely. We tend to imagine that fear of intimacy belongs to people who are somehow broken, or incapable of love. That's rarely accurate. More often it belongs to people who loved very deeply once, felt that love go wrong in a way that genuinely hurt them, and drew a private, unspoken conclusion afterward. Something like, "I will not let myself feel that much again," not as a dramatic declaration, but as a quiet internal setting that shapes behavior for years afterward, without ever being consciously revisited. That kind of person is not cold. In many cases, they're the opposite. Someone capable of enormous feeling, who has simply learned to manage that capacity by keeping it contained. And containment works, right up until someone comes along who doesn't trigger the usual defenses. Someone who feels, somehow, different, safer, and that is precisely when the old system becomes unstable. So when someone like this feels real closeness forming, something strange happens. The same moment that should feel like relief instead triggers alarm. And the nervous system does what nervous systems are built to do when they sense danger. It pulls back. This is why the distance so often arrives right after the good moment, not during a bad one. If the connection had stayed shallow, there would be nothing to protect. It's precisely because it started to matter that the retreat became necessary. Jung had a term for the parts of ourselves we push into hiding because they feel too exposing to look at directly. He called it the shadow, not because it's evil, not in the dramatic sense people sometimes imagine, but because it lives in the dark, unexamined, unspoken, quietly running the show from somewhere, just out of view. For many people, vulnerability itself lives inside that shadow. The desire to be loved, fully and without defense, gets buried alongside everything else that once felt too dangerous to want out loud. And here is the part that explains so much of the confusion you may have felt. When you got close to this person, you weren't just meeting them. You were, without realizing it, meeting the exact thing they had spent years trying not to feel. Your presence didn't create the fear. It revealed it. Like a light turned on in a room someone had deliberately kept dark. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it reframes almost everything. A person who is truly indifferent to you has no reason to manage their behavior around you at all. They don't need to retreat, because there's nothing to retreat from. Retreat is not the behavior of someone who feels nothing. It's the behavior of someone actively managing something they feel too much of. The energy it takes to consistently create distance from another person is not a small thing. It requires ongoing effort, ongoing vigilance, a kind of constant internal negotiation. People do not spend that much energy protecting themselves from something meaningless. That's a strange kind of power to have over someone, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. You didn't do anything to cause this. You simply existed in a way that felt safe enough, warm enough, real enough, that the old defenses started to loosen. And for someone unused to that feeling, loosened defenses don't feel like relief. They feel like losing control. So they pulled back. Not from you exactly, from what you were making them feel. This is where most explanations of this pattern stop, and it's also where they become the least useful. Because knowing why someone pulls away doesn't tell you what happens next. So let's go further, because there's a second layer to this that almost nobody talks about. The pulling away is rarely peaceful for the person doing it. This is the part that gets missed most often, because from the outside, distance can look like calm. It can look like someone who has simply moved on, who feels nothing, who has quietly closed a door and walked away without looking back. Internally, it is almost never that simple. Jung believed that what we refuse to feel consciously doesn't disappear. It goes underground, and from underground, it continues to operate, showing up in mood, in dreams, in restlessness that has no obvious cause, in the strange experience of thinking about someone you've told yourself doesn't matter anymore. The feelings didn't go away when the person pulled back. They just stopped being visible. And feelings that stop being visible do not stop being real. This is why so many people in this exact situation describe the same strange contradiction. The person pulled away, and yet somehow their presence still lingers. A message left unanswered that gets reread anyway. A memory that surfaces at an inconvenient time. A silence that feels, against all logic, like it's carrying weight rather than emptiness. If you've sensed that, if some part of you has continued to feel a kind of unfinished quality to this connection, even in the distance, you are very likely not imagining it. Emotional bonds do not obey the same rules as physical proximity. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes silence is where the most intense version of the feeling is actually happening, just with nowhere safe to go. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with maintaining distance from someone you're still deeply affected by, and it rarely gets talked about, because from the outside, it's invisible. Imagine for a moment what it actually takes to consistently manage a feeling you've decided not to act on. Every message not sent. Every impulse to reach out, redirected somewhere else. Every quiet moment where your mind wanders back to a person you've told yourself you're supposed to be over, followed by the effort of pulling your attention back to something else entirely. That is not restfulness. That is labor, repeated daily, often for far longer than anyone on the outside would guess. This is part of why the eventual return, if it happens, so often looks different than people expect. It rarely arrives as a grand gesture. More often, it looks like exhaustion winning out over defense, a person simply running out of the energy required to keep pretending they don't feel what they feel. Now here is the part that tends to surprise people the most, because it flips the entire situation on its head. The distance is not evidence that the connection wasn't real. It is often evidence that it was. Shallow connections don't require this much internal defense. Nobody builds walls around something that never threatened to matter. So if you've been quietly asking yourself whether what you felt was real, whether you imagined a depth that was never actually there, consider this instead. The intensity of someone's retreat is frequently proportional to the intensity of what they were retreating from. A person doesn't need thick walls to protect against something small, but, and this matters enormously, understanding why someone does this is not the same thing as being responsible for fixing it. This is where a lot of well-meaning people lose themselves, because it's easy to hear an explanation like this and immediately think, then I just need to be more patient, more understanding. I need to wait long enough, love gently enough, prove consistently enough, and eventually the walls will come down. Sometimes that happens. Often it doesn't, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because no amount of patience from another person can substitute for the internal work someone has to do themselves. You cannot love someone out of a fear that took years to build. You cannot outwait a nervous system's learned response to closeness. That work belongs to them, and only them, no matter how much you care. What you can do is something different, and in many ways, more powerful. You can stay honest about what you feel without shrinking it to make someone else more comfortable. You can hold compassion for their fear without carrying it as your own burden. You can remain open to the possibility that they find their way back to you, without organizing your entire emotional life around waiting for that to happen. Jung wrote about a process he called individuation, the long, often uncomfortable process of becoming a fully integrated person, someone whose conscious life and hidden, unconscious life are no longer at war with each other. For the person who keeps disappearing on you, that process is often exactly what's missing. They haven't yet done the work of facing what closeness triggers in them. And painful as this is to hear, that work cannot be completed by you loving them harder. It can only be completed by them. There is, however, something worth understanding about timing, because it isn't always permanent. People do change. The same fear that causes someone to retreat again and again can, eventually, become more exhausting to maintain than the vulnerability it was protecting against. Jung noted that transformation rarely happens while a person is comfortable. It happens when the old pattern stops working, when avoidance costs more than honesty would have. If that shift happens for the person you're thinking of right now, it will not be because you chased harder or waited longer. It will be because something inside them finally became too heavy to keep carrying alone. And if it doesn't happen, that is not a verdict on your worth. It's simply the truth of where they are, separate from anything you did or didn't do. So where does that leave you? Before answering that, it's worth turning the lens around for a moment, because this pattern rarely exists in only one direction. If you've spent real time and energy trying to understand someone else's fear of closeness, it's worth asking honestly what that effort has been costing you. Not as self-criticism, but as simple awareness. People who are drawn to explaining away someone else's distance often have their own complicated relationship with wanting things too visibly. Sometimes the pull toward understanding a guarded person comes from genuine compassion. Sometimes it comes from something quieter, a familiarity with loving people who are hard to reach, a comfort with longing that has become, without anyone choosing it, more familiar than the comfort of being fully chosen. That's not a flaw. It's simply worth noticing, because patterns tend to repeat until they're seen clearly. If this particular shape of connection, close, then distant, then close again, feels oddly familiar, like something you've lived through more than once, with more than one person, that repetition is information. It may be less about any single person, and more about a kind of connection you've unconsciously learned to expect, even when part of you is exhausted by it. Jung believed that we are often drawn toward exactly the situations that will force us to look at what we've avoided looking at in ourselves. If that's true here, then this connection may be serving two purposes at once. It may be revealing something unfinished in them, and it may also be revealing something worth examining in you, perhaps a pattern of accepting less certainty than you deserve, or mistaking intensity for depth, or feeling most alive in situations that keep you slightly off balance. None of that makes what you feel less real. It simply means the growth available here isn't only about them. It leaves you exactly where every person in this situation eventually has to arrive, whether they want to or not, at a choice between two kinds of waiting. One kind of waiting empties you slowly, checking, hoping, interpreting every small sign, organizing your peace of mind around someone else's unpredictable timeline. The other kind of waiting is different. It's rooted, not desperate. It says, I see what's happening. I understand it isn't really about me. I am willing to remain open if this becomes real, but I am not willing to disappear from my own life while I wait to find out. That second kind of waiting is not coldness, and it is not giving up. It is, if anything, the most respectful thing you can offer both yourself and the other person, because it removes pressure from a situation that pressure has never once solved. People rarely soften under pressure. They soften when they feel safe enough to stop defending, and safety is far more likely to come from someone grounded than from someone anxiously waiting for a sign. There's a quiet kind of strength in this that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not the strength of forcing an outcome, and it's not the strength of pretending you feel nothing while you wait. It's something steadier than either of those. It's the strength of staying fully present in your own life, your own routines, your own growth, your own relationships with other people, while still leaving a door open without standing guard at it. That's a very different posture than the one most people default to, which is either chasing or shutting down completely. Both of those, in their own way, keep you tethered to someone else's timeline. Staying grounded doesn't. And here's something worth considering, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. If this connection is meant to become something real, it will not be because you managed to perform patience perfectly, or said exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. It will be because two people, independently, did their own inner work and arrived at honesty around the same time. You cannot control the timing of someone else's readiness. You can only control whether you're living a life you're proud of while you wait to find out. If this described someone in your life, I hope it brought you a little more clarity than confusion. Not certainty about what happens next. Nobody can promise you that, and anyone who claims they can is telling you what you want to hear rather than the truth. But clarity about the shape of what you're dealing with. A pattern with a real human explanation behind it, rather than a mystery that leaves you blaming yourself for something that was never yours to solve. Whatever this person chooses, however long it takes them to choose it, you remain worthy of a love that doesn't require you to interpret silence as a second language. Stay open, stay honest, but stay whole, regardless of how long the distance lasts. If this helped you understand something you've been carrying for a while, that's exactly what this was made for.